The smell of wax and fear hung thick in the temple air. 8-year-old Jeanne Greene knelt on the stone floor, her white ceremonial dress pooling around her like spilled milk. The fabric was too fine, too beautiful for a child from a border village. That's how she knew this was real. This wasn't a nightmare she could wake from. "Keep your head down," her father whispered from somewhere behind her, his voice cracking. "Don't look at him directly." But Jeanne had already looked. The vampire king stood at the altar, 15 feet of empty air separating them. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just existed in a way that made the candles flicker and the very stones of the temple feel smaller. Eldrath Drevian. Even his name felt heavy in her mind. He was impossibly tall, wrapped in midnight robes that seemed to drink the light. His skin was pale as fresh snow, his hair silver white and falling past his shoulders. But it was his eyes, crimson, deep as old wine, ancient as the mountains, that made Jeanne's small hands tremble against her lap. Those eyes were looking at her, only at her. "The terms are accepted," the village elder said, his voice hollow with resignation. He stood beside Jeanne, one gnarled hand on her shoulder. "The debt is paid. The child is yours to claim, your majesty, on the terms of the Covenant of Thorns." Behind her, Jeanne heard her mother sob. Once, quickly smothered. The vampire king moved. One moment he was at the altar. The next he was there, kneeling before her, close enough that she could see the inhuman perfection of his face, the way his presence made the air feel colder, heavier. He smelled like winter roses and old parchment and something else. Something that made the animal part of her brain scream run, but she didn't run. She was 8 years old, wearing a dress that wasn't hers, in a ceremony she didn't understand, and running wouldn't change anything. "Jeanne Greene," the king said softly. His voice was beautiful, terrible, like music played on an instrument made of bones. "Do you know why you are here?" She shook her head, blonde curls falling across her face. "Your bloodline owes a debt," he continued, reaching into his robes. 3 generations ago, your great-grandmother made a pact to save this village from the plague. The price was deferred. Tonight, that price comes due." He withdrew something from his cloak, a pendant of black iron and crimson crystal, shaped like a rose with thorns that seemed to move in the candlelight. "I am placing my claim upon you," Eldrath Drevian said, his crimson eyes holding hers. "You will wear this mark, you will grow under its protection and its burden, and on your 26th birthday, you will return to me, willingly or not." "What happens then?" Jeanne whispered. The corner of his perfect mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Then, Jeanne Greene, you become mine. Forever." He fastened the pendant around her small neck. The moment the chain touched her skin, Jeanne felt it. A thread of ice sinking into her chest, wrapping around something vital and deep. A tether, a binding, a countdown. The vampire king stood, his cloak billowing like wings. 18 years, he said to the room, to her parents, to the girl who would spend the rest of her childhood watching the calendar creep toward her doom. Treasure them. Then he was gone, and Jeanne was left kneeling in the temple, one hand pressed to the cold pendant at her throat, understanding with the clarity only children possess. Her life was no longer her own. The summons arrived on a Tuesday. Jeanne had always imagined it would come at midnight, delivered by something with wings and too many teeth. Instead, it arrived at noon, brought by a courier in a black suit who handed the envelope to her father at the apartment door and left without waiting for a response. There was no need to wait. Everyone knew there was only one answer. Her father's hand shook as he brought the sealed letter into the living room. Jeanne was at the dining table, her laptop open, surrounded by printed articles and photocopied manuscripts from the university archives. Research. preparation. 18 years of searching for a way out, and she'd found exactly one possibility. A single clause in an ancient text about the Covenant of Thorns that suggested the claimed party had rights within the binding itself. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "Jeanne," her father said. She looked up, saw the black envelope in his hands, the silver seal already broken, the rose and thorns emblem pressed into wax. Her mother appeared from the kitchen, dish towel clutched in white-knuckled fists. Jeanne carefully closed her laptop. She'd bookmarked the page weeks ago, knowing she wouldn't have time to finish her research, knowing that after today, nothing she'd found would matter anyway. "When?" she asked quietly. Her father's voice cracked. "Tonight. Sunset. A car will come. 26 years, 364 days, and approximately 6 hours." The pendant at her throat pulsed once, a cold flutter against her skin. It had done that more frequently in recent weeks, like a heartbeat counting down. She'd never been able to remove it. Jewelers had tried. A priest had tried. A witch she'd found through a Reddit forum had tried, then refused payment and told Jeanne's mother to pray for her daughter's soul. Nothing broke the Vampire King's claim. "I'll pack," Jeanne said. "Baby, you don't have to—" her mother started. "Yes, I do." Jeanne stood, smoothing her jeans with hands steadier than she felt. "We've always known this day would come." Her mother made a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "You were supposed to have more time, another week at least. Your birthday isn't until—" "He's calling me early." Jeanne touched the pendant, felt its unnatural chill through her sweater. "He can do that. It's in the terms." She'd memorized every clause, every archaic phrase of the covenant she could find in the university's restricted collection. Knowledge was the only weapon she had. Her father set the summons on the table. Jeanne didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of those words, the inevitability of them, pressing down like stone. "There has to be a way out," her father said desperately. "The Supernatural Relations Council, they could appeal to—" "To whom, Papa?" Jeanne turned to face him and saw herself reflected in his eyes. Blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, blue eyes that hadn't been truly carefree since she was 8, a face that had grown beautiful despite her best efforts to hide behind books and oversized cardigans. "To the king himself? He is the law in the Northern Territories. The Covenant predates every human government we have. It's grandfathered into every supernatural treaty. Then we run. Tonight. Before sunset. We take you to California, to Tokyo, somewhere he can't—" "The pendant is a tether." Jeanne's hand went to her throat again, a habit she'd developed over 18 years. "You know this. Dr. Wei at the Institute explained it when I was 12. If I try to flee, the king can pull me back. Through space itself if necessary, and he'll consider it a breach of terms." She didn't say what happened to those who breached terms with Eldrath Drevian. They all knew the stories. Her mother crossed the small living room and pulled Jeanne into her arms, squeezing tight enough to hurt. She smelled like coffee and vanilla lotion, like every safe morning of Jeanne's childhood. "My brave girl," she whispered. "My brilliant, brave girl." Jeanne closed her eyes and let herself be held. Let herself be small again, just for a moment. Then she pulled away. "I need to pack," she repeated. "And I need the family records, the original documents, the genealogy files, everything we have from great-grandmother's time." Her father frowned. "Why?" Jeanne turned her laptop screen toward him, showed him the scanned manuscript page she'd been studying. Ancient script, partially translated. "Because the covenant was a bargain, and bargains have terms. I'm going to make him honor every single one." Her mother's eyes widened. "Jeanne, you can't possibly think—" "I think I've spent 18 years preparing for this." Jeanne met her mother's gaze steadily. I'm not going to his castle to die. I'm going to negotiate. Outside, the afternoon sun climbed toward its apex. 6 hours until sunset. 6 hours until the Vampire King came to collect what he'd claimed all those years ago. Jeanne Greene went to pack for forever. The car arrived exactly at sunset, as silent as a held breath. Jeanne watched it appear at the end of their street. A sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows so dark they looked like portals to nothing. No headlights, no engine sound. Just there, suddenly, as if it had materialized from the shadows themselves. Neighbors peered, through curtains. Mrs. Chen from 4B stepped onto her balcony, phone in hand, though she wouldn't call anyone. The handful of people who knew what Jeanne was, what she'd been marked for, understood that interference meant death. The rest just sensed something wrong and stayed inside. Miss Greene. The driver emerged from the car, inhumanly graceful in a black suit. His skin was pale as paper, his voice without inflection. He didn't ask if she was ready, didn't offer condolences, simply opened the rear door and waited. Jeanne's single suitcase had already been loaded into the trunk. Inside it, clothes, her laptop, external hard drives full of research, the family documents, and her grandmother's silver locket. Everything she owned that mattered, condensed into 50 pounds. Everything she was leaving behind couldn't fit in any suitcase. Her father embraced her first, his accountant's hands shaking against her back. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm so sorry, little bird. It's not your fault." Jeanne had said this 1,000 times. It never made either of them feel better. Her mother held her last and longest, stroking her hair like she had when Jeanne was small. "Remember who you are," she said fiercely. "Remember you are Jeanne Greene, and you are not powerless. No matter what he says, no matter what he does." Jeanne nodded against her mother's shoulder, not trusting her voice. Then she pulled away, shouldered her backpack, and walked to the car before her courage could fail. The door closed with a sound like a coffin ceiling. Inside, the car was leather and wood paneling, lit by soft ambient lighting that had no visible source. Jeanne settled into the seat, adjusting her jacket, and looked out the window one last time. Her parents stood on the sidewalk outside their building, holding each other. Her father raised one hand. Her mother's lips moved in what might have been a prayer. The car pulled away, utterly silent, and they disappeared. Jeanne watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood blur past. The coffee shop where she'd spent countless hours studying, the bookstore where she'd hidden in the history section as a teenager, the university campus where she'd spent 6 years earning degrees in history and antiquities, desperately searching for escape clauses in covenants written centuries before her great-grandmother was born. All of it falling away behind her like shed skin. The pendant at her throat pulsed steadily now, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Growing warmer. She was heading toward its source, toward the hand that had placed it there 18 years ago, toward Eldrath Drevian. Jeanne closed her eyes and let herself remember him as he'd been that night. Impossibly tall, inhumanly beautiful, ancient beyond comprehension. She'd been too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, too small to grasp that she was being claimed like property, catalogued and marked for future. Collection. She understood now. The car turned north, leaving the city. Through the window, Jeanne watched streetlights give way to darkness, watched civilization thin and disappear. They were entering the border territories now, the lands that belonged more to the Nightborn than to any human jurisdiction. The vampire lands. Her hand found her phone in her jacket pocket. 3 missed texts from her advisor at the university, asking about her dissertation timeline. 2 from her friend Marcus, asking if she wanted to grab drinks this weekend. 1 from her mother sent 5 minutes ago. "I love you. Come home to us." Jeanne turned the phone off. There was no coming home. There never had been. Her other hand found the small notebook tucked into her backpack, her research journal, where she'd hand-copied every scrap of information about the Covenant of Thorns she'd discovered. The clause that haunted her thoughts was on page 47, written in her own careful handwriting. The claimed, upon the hour of binding, holds right of supplication. One demand, one condition, one price to be named. The claimant must hear the terms, though acceptance remains within their sovereign power. One demand, one chance to turn this claiming into something other than absolute surrender. Jeanne opened her eyes and stared out at the darkness rushing past. Somewhere ahead, rising from the northern mountains like a monument to immortal power, was Drevian Castle. And inside it, waiting with the patience of something that had existed for centuries, was the king who owned her. Or thought he did. She touched the pendant one more time, felt its eager warmth against her skin. It knew it was going home. This piece of the king's power wrapped around her throat for 18 years. "So do I," Jeanne whispered to the empty car. She'd spent her whole life in chains she couldn't see, bound by a bargain she'd never made. But she'd also spent that life learning exactly how those chains worked, studying the precise terms of her imprisonment. Tonight, Eldrath Drevian expected a frightened girl to arrive at his castle. Instead, he was getting Jeanne Greene, researcher, historian, and the only person alive who'd read every word of the Covenant of Thorns, and she was done being afraid. The castle appeared like a wound in the landscape. One moment there was only forest and mountain darkness. The next, the trees parted and Drevian Castle rose before her, a sprawling fortress of black stone and crimson-lit windows, ancient and impossibly vast, perched on the mountainside as if it had grown there rather than been built. Jeanne's breath caught despite herself. She'd seen pictures, of course, grainy historical photographs, satellite images that never quite captured the structure properly, artist renderings from the 18th century. None of them had prepared her for the reality of it. The castle didn't just occupy space, it dominated it, pulling at something primal in her chest that whispered run and kneel in the same breath. The pendant burned hot against her throat. The car glided through iron gates that opened without being touched, up a long drive lined with trees that looked dead even in summer. Other vehicles were parked in the circular courtyard. Sleek black cars like hers, a vintage Rolls-Royce, something that looked European and expensive. Evidence of other vampires, other court members, other witnesses to whatever came next. The driver opened her door. "Miss Greene, you are expected." Jeanne stepped out into air that smelled like old stone and night-blooming flowers, and something else. Something copper-sweet that made her stomach turn. Blood. Old blood. Soaked into the foundation of this place over centuries. This was where people came to lose their lives, one way or another. The castle's main entrance was a set of double doors 3 times her height, carved with intricate scenes of roses and thorns and things with too many teeth. They opened as she approached, revealing a grand entrance hall lit by chandeliers that sparkled with what looked like diamonds, but were probably something else. Something taken from people who'd crossed a vampire king and paid for it. Jeanne Greene. A woman appeared from the shadows, inhumanly beautiful with dark skin and eyes like molten gold. She wore a tailored burgundy suit that probably cost more than Jeanne's entire education. "I am Sylvain, seneschal of this house. His Majesty is occupied with court business. I will show you to your chambers." Not a room. Chambers. "When will I see him?" Jeanne asked, surprised her voice came out steady. Sylvain's smile was sharp. "When he wishes to see you. This way." They climbed a grand staircase, turned down a corridor lined with portraits of pale, beautiful faces with cruel eyes, past windows that showed nothing but darkness and mountain void. The castle felt endless, a labyrinth designed to swallow people whole. Finally, Sylvain stopped before an ornate door. Your quarters. Your belongings have already been brought up. Dinner will be sent at 9. Do not leave this wing without escort. She paused, her golden eyes scanning Jeanne with something like pity. You are claimed, Miss Greene, but you are not yet bound. Until the ceremony, you remain fragile. There are those in this court who would test that fragility. Meaning what? Meaning stay in your room. Sylvain turned to leave, then hesitated. For what it's worth, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone crying. Most of them cry. Sylvain disappeared down the corridor, her heels clicking against marble. Jeanne pushed open the door. The room beyond was obscene in its luxury, a 4-poster bed large enough for 5 people, draped in midnight blue silk. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. A bathroom visible through an open door that was bigger than her entire apartment. Antique furniture that belonged in museums. Her suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, looking pathetic and small. She walked to the window, pressed her hand against the cold glass. From here, she could see the forest stretching endlessly, the lights of her city just barely visible in the far distance. Impossibly far. Another world entirely. Behind her, the door opened. Jeanne turned, expecting Sylvain. It wasn't Sylvain. Eldrath Drevian stood in the doorway, and 18 years collapsed into nothing. He looked exactly as she remembered, and nothing like she remembered. Taller than any human, wrapped in a black suit that probably cost more than her car. Silver-white hair falling past his shoulders, pale skin that seemed to drink the light. But it was his eyes, crimson, ancient, fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak, that proved this was real. This was happening. Jeanne Greene, he said, and his voice was winter wind and silk and barely leashed power. You've grown. She forced herself to stand straight to meet those terrible eyes. Your Majesty. He moved into the room, closed the door behind him with a soft click. The space suddenly felt smaller, the air harder to breathe. He studied her the way someone might study a painting they'd commissioned years ago, finally delivered. 18 years, Eldrath said softly. I trust you used them well. I did. Good. He crossed the room, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she could smell him, winter roses and old parchment and something darkly sweet. Because tonight, we begin. And by week's end, Jeanne Greene, you will be mine. Forever. The pendant pulsed once, burning. Jeanne lifted her chin. We'll see. Something flickered in those crimson eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or amusement. Yes, Eldrath Drevian said. We will. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him as silently as he'd entered. Jeanne's legs gave out. She sat on the edge of the massive bed, her whole body shaking. 7 days until the binding ceremony. 7 days to find her leverage. She pulled out her phone. No signal, of course, and opened her research files anyway. Time to work. Jeanne didn't sleep. She spent the night at the antique desk by the window, laptop open, surrounded by printed documents and her handwritten notes. The castle was silent in a way cities never were. No traffic, no sirens, no sounds of neighbors living their lives through thin walls. Just stone and darkness and the occasional whisper of movement in the corridors that might have been wind or might have been something else. The pendant had finally cooled against her skin, but she could still feel it. A constant reminder of the countdown. By dawn, though no sunlight reached this side of the mountain, she'd reread every scrap of research 3 times. The Covenant of Thorns was maddeningly vague in places, archaic and precise in others. But that one clause, the right of supplication, remained clear. One demand, one condition. She had to make it count. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Miss Greene. Sylvain entered without waiting for permission, carrying a garment bag. His Majesty requests your presence at breakfast. You'll want to change." Jeanne looked down at her jeans and wrinkled sweater, the same clothes she'd traveled in. "What's wrong with what I'm wearing?" "Nothing, if you wish to announce to the entire court that you're unprepared for this world." Sylvain hung the bag on the bathroom door. "The court gathers for the morning meal. They will be evaluating you, judging whether you're worthy of their king." "I didn't ask to be worthy of their king." "No, but you're here anyway." Sylvain's expression softened slightly. "I've laid out appropriate attire. Breakfast is in 30 minutes. Someone will escort you." She left before Jeanne could argue. The garment bag contained a dress, deep emerald silk, elegant but not overly formal, with long sleeves and a neckline high enough to almost hide the pendant. Almost. Beside it, low heels that actually fit her feet perfectly. Of course they knew her size. They'd been watching her for 18 years. Jeanne showered quickly, changed, and was pulling her damp hair into a bun when another knock came. This time, a young vampire, male, with copper hair and eyes like amber, stood in the hallway. "Miss Greene, I'm Cassian. I'll take you to the breakfast hall." He was polite but distant as he led her through the castle's maze of corridors. Morning light, artificial, Jeanne realized, filtered through windows, but it had a strange quality. Too perfect, too controlled. They passed other vampires, all beautiful, all deadly, all turning to watch her with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. The breakfast hall was smaller than she'd expected, almost intimate. A long table set for perhaps 20, already half full with court members who stopped their conversations as she entered. Eldrath sat at the head of the table. He'd changed from last night's suit to something equally formal, dark gray, that made his silver hair seem to glow. Those crimson eyes found her immediately, tracked her movement as Cassian guided her to a seat. Not beside the king, but not far from him either. A position of significance. A position that announced her status to everyone watching. "Miss Greene," Eldrath said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence. "I trust your accommodations are acceptable." "They're fine, thank you." Jeanne sat, hyper-aware of every eye on her. "Excellent." He gestured, and servants appeared. Human servants, she noted with a jolt, carrying trays of food, fruit, pastries, things that looked normal except for the sheer excess of it. "I thought we might discuss the week's schedule." "The trials," a voice said from across the table. A female vampire with ice-blonde hair and a smile like a blade. "Surely you're not abandoning tradition, Your Majesty." Eldrath's expression didn't change. "Lady Morgaine raises a valid point. The Covenant requires certain formalities before the binding can be completed." "Trials," Jeanne repeated carefully. "3 tests," Eldrath said, his eyes never leaving hers. "To prove the claimed is worthy of the bond, tradition dating back to the first Covenant." "Tests of what?" "Worthiness, strength, will." Morgaine leaned forward, her smile sharpening. "Most claimants fail at least one. It's not uncommon." "And if I fail?" The room went very quiet. Eldrath took a sip of something dark red in a crystal glass. Not wine. "Then the binding cannot proceed. The Covenant would be renegotiated." Which meant what? Her death? Her family's punishment? She'd found no clear answer in her research. "When do these trials begin?" Jeanne asked. "Tonight." Eldrath set down his glass. "The first trial is the Court of Shadows. You will be presented to the full court and must answer their questions, satisfy their concerns about a human joining our ranks." "I thought I didn't have a choice about joining your ranks." Something flickered in his eyes. "You don't. But they deserve to understand who I'm binding myself to for eternity." The weight of that word, eternity, settled over the table like frost. "And the other 2 trials?" Jeanne pressed. "The second is the blood oath." The third, Eldrath paused, his gaze intensifying. The third is between you and me alone. Morgaine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How romantic. And if she fails, Your Majesty? What then? Eldrath's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. She won't fail. It wasn't confidence in Jeanne's abilities. It was a command. Jeanne met his eyes across the table, understanding suddenly that these trials weren't just about proving herself to the court. They were about breaking her will before the binding. Making sure that when Eldrath Drevian claimed her forever, there would be nothing left to resist. She picked up her fork, took a deliberate bite of fruit. I look forward to it, she said. Let him think she was already broken. She'd learned a long time ago that underestimation was its own kind of weapon. The Court of Shadows convened at midnight. Jeanne spent the day preparing, not with clothes or cosmetics. Though Sylvain had delivered another garment bag, this one containing a gown of deep crimson that felt like a cruel joke. But with research. She'd brought her laptop to the castle's library, a vast room of ancient texts and modern technology existing in uneasy coexistence, and buried herself in everything she could find about vampire court protocol. Knowledge was armor. It always had been. By the time Cassian came to escort her, she'd memorized the names and positions of every major court member, understood the hierarchy, and identified the 3 vampires most likely to challenge her presence. Morgaine, obviously, Lord Theron, an ancient who'd served as Eldrath's advisor for 2 centuries, and Lady Seraphine, who'd apparently been intended as Eldrath's consort before the Covenant superseded political convenience. You look nervous, Cassian observed as they walked through shadowed corridors. I'm terrified, Jeanne said honestly. He blinked, surprised by her candor. Most claimants lie about that. What's the point? They can probably smell fear anyway. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Yes, we can. They arrived at a set of massive doors carved with night-blooming roses. Beyond them, Jeanne could hear voices, movement, the subtle rustle of predators gathering. One piece of advice, Cassian said quietly. Don't look away first. If you break eye contact, they'll know your prey. The doors opened. The throne room was exactly as terrifying as she'd imagined. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness. Chandeliers of black crystal and silver cast shadows that moved wrong. And vampires, dozens of them, lined both sides of a long crimson carpet that led to a dais, where Eldrath sat on a throne that looked carved from obsidian. He wore black and crimson, his silver hair loose around his shoulders, a crown of twisted metal and dark gems resting on his head. Every inch the immortal king. His eyes found hers across the distance, and the pendant at her throat flared hot. Jeanne Greene, his voice rang out, echoing through the chamber. Approach. Jeanne forced her legs to move. The carpet felt endless. On either side, vampires watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to hunger to open disdain. She kept her chin up, her gaze forward, remembering Cassian's advice. Don't look away first. She stopped at the base of the dais, 3 steps below Eldrath's throne. Kneel. Morgaine's voice cut through the silence. Jeanne's jaw tightened. Nothing in the Covenant required her to kneel. She'd checked. She is claimed, not bound, Eldrath said softly, but his voice carried absolute authority. She kneels to no one but me, and I have not asked it of her. Morgaine's smile was poisonous, but she inclined her head. Eldrath stood, descended the steps until he was close enough that Jeanne could feel the cold radiating from him. My court, he said, addressing the room while his eyes remained on her. I present Jeanne Greene, bearer of the Covenant mark, descendant of Eleanor Greene who made the original pact. In 7 days, she will be bound to me for eternity. Tonight, you may voice your questions, your concerns. She will answer. He stepped aside, leaving Jeanne exposed. Lord Theron spoke first, his voice like gravel. What makes a human worthy of standing beside our king for eternity? Nothing, Jeanne said, and heard the ripple of shock. I'm not worthy. I didn't ask for this honor, and I don't claim to deserve it. But the Covenant doesn't require worthiness. It requires blood, lineage, and the fulfillment of an oath my ancestor made. Honest, at least, Theron murmured. What do you know of our world? This from a vampire with midnight skin and eyes like stars. Our laws? Our ways? I know you've existed alongside humanity for millennia. I know your territories are recognized by 17 nations under the Preternatural Accords of 1952. I know you have your own legal system, your own hierarchies, and that His Majesty's kingdom is one of 7 sovereign vampire states. Jeanne met the vampire's gaze steadily. I know you drink blood, live for centuries, and that you consider humans either livestock or nuisances, depending on your politics. Someone laughed. Someone else hissed. Lady Seraphine rose from her seat, beautiful and deadly in silver silk. And what happens when you age, human? When you grow old and ugly while he remains eternal? What then? The room went silent. Jeanne had wondered this herself, spent sleepless nights imagining it. I don't know, she admitted. The Covenant doesn't specify. Maybe I'll age and die. Maybe the binding prevents it. Maybe he'll grow tired of me and end it himself. She looked directly at Eldrath, who watched her with unreadable eyes. But that's not tonight's concern, is it? No, Eldrath said quietly. It isn't. She has spirit, Morgaine conceded, though her tone suggested this was an insult. But spirit alone won't survive this court. What will you do, Jeanne Greene, when the prettiest monsters you've ever seen smile and offer you everything you've ever wanted? When they whisper that the king is cruel, that the binding is slavery, that they can help you escape? Jeanne turned to face Morgaine fully. I'll remember that vampires don't do anything out of kindness, that every offer has a price, and that the only thing more dangerous than being bound to your king is being indebted to his court. Morgaine's eyes flashed. Clever girl. Are there more questions? Eldrath asked. Silence. Then the first trial is complete. He extended his hand to Jeanne. You've satisfied the court's concerns. Jeanne stared at his outstretched hand, pale and perfect, and offering something that felt like a trap. But refusing in front of the entire court would be its own kind of failure. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, ice cold and impossibly strong, and he pulled her up the steps to stand beside his throne. Let it be known, Eldrath said to the assembled court, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that looked possessive and felt like a brand. Jeanne Greene has passed the Court of Shadows. In 6 days, she will be mine. The court bowed as one, and Jeanne stood beside a vampire king, her hand trapped in his, understanding that she'd won this battle. But the war had only just begun. Eldrath didn't release her hand. Even after the court dispersed, after the throne room emptied of vampires who bowed and smiled with too many teeth, his fingers remained locked around hers, cold, unbreakable. You did well, he said finally, his voice low, enough that only she could hear. You sound surprised. I am. He turned to face her fully, and this close she could see the fine details of his inhuman face, the perfect symmetry, the way his skin seemed carved from marble, the faint trace of veins beneath the surface that no longer carried warmth. Most claimants either weep or rage. You did neither. Would it have helped? No. Jeanne tried to pull her hand free. His grip tightened, not painfully, but enough to remind her exactly how much stronger he was. The second trial is tomorrow night, Eldrath continued. The Blood Oath. Which is? Exactly what it sounds like. He raised their joined hands, studying her wrist with the focus of a scientist examining a specimen. You'll drink from me, I'll drink from you, the beginning of the binding. Jeanne's stomach turned. That's not in the Covenant. It's older than the Covenant. Tradition from before your ancestors' time. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, feeling the frantic beat of her heart. Your blood will carry my essence. Mine will carry yours. We'll be connected. We're already connected, Jeanne said, touching the pendant with her free hand. This thing has been connected to me for 18 years. That's a claim. A mark of ownership. Eldrath's eyes lifted to hers, crimson and ancient and hungry. The blood oath is different. You'll feel what I feel. Know when I'm near. Sense my emotions. And you'll sense mine. Yes. Which meant no more hiding. No more pretending she wasn't terrified. Wasn't desperately searching for a way out. He'd know everything. And if I refuse? Jeanne asked. Eldrath smiled, and it was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. You won't. He released her hand finally, and Jeanne resisted the urge to cradle it against her chest. Cassian will escort you back to your chambers. Rest. Tomorrow will be intense. Wait. Jeanne's voice stopped him as he turned to leave. The third trial. What is it? Eldrath paused at the base of the dais, his back to her. The third trial is surrender. Surrender to what? To me. He looked back over his shoulder, and the hunger in his eyes was unmistakable now. Completely. Willingly. That's what the Covenant requires in the end, Jeanne. Not your defiance. Not your clever answers. Your absolute submission. Then he was gone, moving with that impossible vampire speed, leaving her alone in the massive throne room. Jeanne's legs gave out. She sat on the steps of the dais, her whole body shaking. Surrender. Submission. Everything she'd spent 18 years refusing to give. He enjoys the dramatic exit. Cassian's voice echoed from the doorway. Are you all right? No. Jeanne forced herself to stand. But I don't think that matters. Cassian led her back through the castle's labyrinth. The corridors felt different now, more oppressive, as if the stone itself was closing in. They passed a window overlooking the mountains, and Jeanne stopped, pressing her hand against the glass. Could I leave? She asked quietly. If I ran right now, how far would I get? To the gate, maybe. The forest, if you were lucky. Cassian's reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. The pendant would burn. Your chest would feel like it was being crushed. By the time you reached the tree line, you'd be screaming. His Majesty would simply pull you back. Has anyone ever tried? 3 that I know of. One made it to the highway before her heart stopped. Cassian's expression was carefully neutral. The king revived her. The binding proceeded as planned. Jeanne closed her eyes. What happened to her? She's been his consort for 40 years now. Lady Astrid. You'll meet her eventually. He paused. She doesn't run anymore. They continued in silence until they reached her chambers. Cassian opened the door, then hesitated. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you're the first claimant I've seen who looks at him like he's a problem to solve, rather than a monster to fear. Maybe he's both. Maybe. Cassian's smile was sad. But I don't think solving him is possible, Miss Greene. He's had 200 years to become exactly what he is. Jeanne stepped into her room, turned back. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why does he need the Covenant? He's a king. He could have anyone. Why bind himself to a human through an ancient pact? Cassian looked uncomfortable. That's not my question to answer. But you know. I know what the court knows, that the Covenant of Thorns is more than a debt repayment, that it's tied to something older, something that keeps the balance between our world and yours. He met her eyes. And I know that if the binding fails, if you refuse the final trial, the consequences won't just fall on you. What does that mean? Ask him tomorrow, after the blood oath, when you can feel his truth. Cassian bowed slightly. Good night, Miss Greene. The door closed, leaving Jeanne alone. She went straight to her laptop, pulling up her research files. Somewhere in all these documents, there had to be more information about what the Covenant actually was, what it protected, why it required her specifically. The claimed, upon the hour of binding, holds right of supplication. One demand, one condition. But she was starting to realize she didn't fully understand what she was demanding freedom from. Or what would happen to everyone else if she succeeded. Her phone buzzed. She had signal again, somehow. A text from her mother. "Are you safe?" Jeanne stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "I don't know yet." Outside her window, the moon rose over the mountains, full and cold and watching. Tomorrow night, she would share blood with a vampire king. And after that, there would be nowhere left to hide. The blood oath took place in a room Jeanne had never seen. Sylvain came for her at sunset, leading her through parts of the castle that felt older, more primal. The walls here were bare stone, the air thick with the scent of earth and something ancient. No windows, no electric lights, just torches that burned with flames too red to be natural. "This is the original heart of the castle," Sylvain explained as they descended a spiral staircase. "Built before electricity, before modern conventions. Some traditions require older spaces." They reached a heavy wooden door bound with iron. Sylvain pushed it open, revealing a circular chamber lit by a ring of candles. The floor was inlaid with silver, intricate patterns of roses and thorns that seemed to move in the flickering light. And in the center, Eldrath waited. He'd abandoned the formal suits. Now he wore simple black, his silver hair unbound, his feet bare on the cold stone. He looked simultaneously more human and less, stripped of civilized trappings, revealing the predator beneath. "Leave us," he said to Sylvain. The door closed with a sound of finality. Jeanne stood at the edge of the silver circle, her heart hammering. She'd changed into the dress Sylvain had brought, deep burgundy silk that left her arms bare, the pendant resting against her collarbone like a brand. "Come here, Jeanne." She forced herself to step into the circle. The moment her foot touched the silver inlay, the pendant flared hot. The designs on the floor began to glow, pulsing with light that matched her heartbeat. Eldrath watched her approach with eyes that tracked every breath, every tremor. "Do you know what this ritual means?" "You'll drink my blood. I'll drink yours. We'll be connected." More than connected. He extended his hand, and this time it wasn't a command, it was an offering. "Our souls will touch. For a moment the barriers between us will fall. You'll feel what I feel. Know what I know." Jeanne stared at his outstretched hand. "And you'll know everything about me." "Yes. My plans, my intentions, the loophole I found." Something flickered across his perfect face. What loophole? So he didn't know. Didn't know she'd found the rite of supplication buried in the ancient texts. That gave her leverage, however small. "If we do this," Jeanne said carefully, "and you learn everything, what's to stop you from simply taking what you want? Forcing the binding without the third trial?" Eldrath's hand remained extended. "The Covenant forbids it. 3 trials must be completed freely, or the binding fails." He paused. "I could compel many things, Jeanne, but not this. Never this." "Why not?" "Because a forced bond is a broken bond. It would corrupt both of us, destroy the very thing the Covenant was meant to protect." His voice softened, almost gentle. "I need your willing surrender, not your defeat." Jeanne took his hand. The moment their skin touched, the silver designs exploded with light. The pendant burned white hot. Eldrath pulled her close, one hand sliding to the small of her back, the other cradling her jaw. "This will hurt," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Then his fangs were in her throat. Pain lanced through her, sharp and terrible, followed immediately by something else, a rush of sensation that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Cold spreading through her veins. Her vision blurred, refocused, and suddenly she could see too much. Feel too much. Eldrath's hunger, vast and ancient and barely controlled. His desire, not just for her blood but for her. The obsession that had grown over 18 years of waiting. His loneliness, centuries of it, pressing down like the weight of mountains. And beneath it all, something unexpected. Fear. He was afraid. Of what, she couldn't grasp before he pulled back. His lips stained crimson. Your turn. He bit his own wrist, held it to her mouth. Drink. Jeanne hesitated. The smell was wrong. Copper and winter and power. But Eldrath's other hand was still at her back, holding her steady, and his eyes were saying, "Trust me," even though trust was the last thing she should give. She drank. His blood was ice and fire and electricity. It burned down her throat, flooded her system, and suddenly the world shattered. She felt him everywhere. His presence wrapped around her consciousness like chains and wings simultaneously. The bond snapping into place, a tether that made the pendant feel like nothing, and she understood. The Covenant wasn't about debt. It was about balance. The vampire world and the human world, held in equilibrium by a single binding. Her bloodline carried something, a spark, a essence that Eldrath's kind needed to maintain their connection to humanity, to keep from becoming pure monsters. Without the binding, without this bridge between worlds, the vampires would lose their last thread of restraint. War would follow, inevitable and catastrophic. Her great-grandmother hadn't made a deal to save a village. She'd made a deal to save everyone. Now you see, Eldrath whispered, and his voice was in her head and in the room simultaneously. Now you understand what you carry, why you're necessary. Jeanne pulled back, stumbling. Her throat ached, her wrist throbbed, and she could feel him, his presence, his emotions, his hunger, like a second heartbeat in her chest. You're a bridge, she said hoarsely. The binding keeps you human, keeps all of you from losing yourselves completely. Yes. Eldrath steadied her, his hands impossibly gentle. Every generation, one binding. One human who carries the old blood, who reminds us what we were, what we still could be. And if I refuse the third trial, if I invoke the right of supplication and demand my freedom? His expression went carefully blank. Then the bridge breaks, the covenant fails, and my people lose the last thing anchoring them to mercy. The silver circle's light was fading. The ritual was complete. Jeanne could feel Eldrath's presence in her mind now, a constant awareness. He was afraid, genuinely afraid, that she'd choose her freedom over the world's safety. You knew I'd found the loophole, she whispered. I suspected. You're too intelligent not to look. His thumb brushed her jaw. What will you demand, Jeanne? What price will you name for your surrender? She met his eyes, felt his fear and hunger and desperate need through the bond. I don't know yet, she said. But she was beginning to understand the weight of the choice, her freedom or everyone's survival. There had to be a third option. She just had to find it before the final trial. Jeanne couldn't escape him anymore. Even back in her chambers, door locked, standing under a scalding shower trying to wash away the feeling of fangs in her throat, she felt him. A presence in the back of her mind like a second consciousness. His emotions bled through the bond. Restlessness, hunger, something that felt almost like regret. She wondered if he could feel her panic. The water ran pink, then clear. The puncture wounds on her throat had already closed, healing with supernatural speed. A gift from his blood, she realized. Or a curse. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel, Her laptop was open on the desk. She hadn't left it open. Jeanne approached slowly, saw a document pulled up on the screen, one of her research files about the Covenant. Except now there was a note typed at the bottom in a font she hadn't used. "You're looking in the wrong place. The answer isn't in the Covenant's terms, it's in what came before." Eldrath had been in her room, had gone through her research, and instead of being angry about her plans to find a loophole, he was helping her? Through the bond, she felt a flicker of amusement. He knew she'd found the note. Jeanne grabbed her phone, typed quickly, "What came before the Covenant?" The response came immediately, though she hadn't given him her number. The first binding. 1247, Prague. A vampire king and a human girl who saved both their peoples. "Meet me in the library, I'll show you." She should refuse, should stay in her room, maintain distance, not let him draw her deeper into whatever game this was. But the bond was pulling at her, and beneath his amusement she felt something else. Sincerity. He genuinely wanted to show her something. Jeanne dressed quickly, practical jeans and a sweater, and opened her door. Eldrath stood in the hallway, leaning against the opposite wall like he'd been waiting. He'd changed too. Dark jeans, a simple black shirt, his hair pulled back. Almost normal, if not for the inhuman perfection and the eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. "You could have just knocked," Jeanne said. "Where's the drama in that?" But his smile was softer than usual. "Come, there's something you need to see." They walked through the castle in silence. Jeanne was hyper-aware of the distance between them. 3 feet, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him, far enough that they weren't touching. But the bond made it feel like touching anyway, like an invisible thread connecting them. "Can you feel me?" she asked quietly. "The way I feel you?" "Yes. Your fear. Your anger. Your determination." Eldrath glanced at her. "And your curiosity? Which is currently winning? Is it always this intense?" "The first few days are strongest. It will settle into something manageable." He paused at a corner. "Unless we complete the final binding, then it becomes permanent, absolute." They reached the library, and Eldrath led her past the modern section to the back, where ancient texts were kept behind climate-controlled glass. He pressed his palm to a scanner, an odd mix of old and new, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden archive. "The restricted collection," Eldrath explained. "Documents too dangerous or too valuable for general access." Inside, the room was small, lined with texts that looked like they'd crumble at a touch. Eldrath went directly to a specific shelf, pulled out a leather-bound book with pages of vellum. "The Chronicle of Bindings," he said, setting it carefully on a reading stand. "Every Covenant binding for the last 8 centuries, documented." He opened to a page near the beginning, and Jeanne saw illuminated script in Latin, with a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and a vampire with golden eyes. "Katerina," Eldrath said softly. "The first, a merchant's daughter from Prague. When the vampire clans were losing themselves to bloodlust, becoming true monsters, she offered herself as a bridge. One human life bound to the king, creating a tether to humanity that would spread through the entire vampire population." "Did she survive it?" "She lived for 63 years as his consort. Died of old age, in his arms." Eldrath's finger traced the portrait. The next binding happened 30 years later, then another. Every generation, the bloodline produces one carrier of the old magic, and we renew the bridge. Jeanne studied the chronicle, flipping through pages. Dozens of women, a few men, all bound to vampire kings throughout history. Some entries were brief. Others detailed long lives, partnerships that seemed almost loving. "Lady Astrid," she said, finding a more recent entry. The woman Cassian had mentioned. "She ran," Eldrath confirmed. I brought her back. She hated me for years. He paused. Now she rules the Eastern Territory at my side. She's one of my most trusted advisors. Because you broke her. Because I gave her time. His eyes met Jeanne's. And because I honored the conditions she demanded during her supplication. Jeanne's breath caught. She used the loophole too. Every intelligent claimant finds it eventually. Eldrath smiled slightly. Did you think you were the first? What did she demand? Autonomy. Her own court, her own territory, freedom to rule as she saw fit within my kingdom. He closed the chronicle carefully. I granted it. The binding proceeded. And over time, obligation became something else. What did the others demand? Jeanne asked, her mind racing. Protection for their families, wealth, political power. One demanded I end a war. Eldrath leaned against the reading stand. The Covenant allows one condition, Jeanne, but it doesn't specify what that condition can be. The only limit is whether I'm willing to grant it. And if you refuse, then the binding fails, the bridge breaks. And we return to what we were before Katarina. Monsters who feed and kill and eventually forget we were ever capable of anything else. Through the bond, Jeanne felt the weight of his words, the genuine fear beneath them. You need this, she said slowly. Not just the political stability. You personally need the binding to stay human. I've lived for 237 years, Eldrath said quietly. I've watched myself become colder, harder, more distant from what I was. The binding is the only thing that pulls me back. So you're not doing this out of duty to some ancient pact. I'm doing it because without it, I'll become the monster you already think I am. His crimson eyes held hers, and I'm terrified of what that would mean. The honesty in his voice, in the bond, was staggering. What will you demand? Eldrath asked. When the time comes for your supplication, what price will you name? Jeanne looked at the chronicle, at centuries of bindings, of women who'd negotiated their survival and found ways to live with the impossible. I want my people free, she said. All the human territories under your protection. True sovereignty, not just autonomy. No more tributes. No more claims. Eldrath went very still. That would destabilize the entire treaty system. Then maybe the system needs to change. Through the bond, she felt his conflict. Respect for her courage, fear of the consequences, and something else. Something that felt almost like pride. The third trial is in 2 days, he said finally. Make your demand then. I'll give you my answer. He left her alone in the archive, surrounded by the ghosts of bindings past. And Jeanne realized she was no longer just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting to change everything. The castle woke her before dawn. Not a sound. Jeanne had learned the castle was always silent in that unnatural vampire way, but a feeling, the bond pulling at her consciousness, Eldrath's presence somewhere below, restless and prowling. She tried to ignore it, burying her face in the pillow. But the pull intensified, became almost physical, and she understood suddenly that he was summoning her. Not with words, but through the blood they'd shared. Jeanne dressed in the dark and followed the sensation through empty corridors, down staircases, until she found herself in a part of the castle she'd never seen. A training room, vast and brutal, with weapons lining the walls and padded mats covering the floor. Eldrath was in the center, moving through forms with a sword that looked like it belonged in a museum. His movements were liquid grace and lethal precision, each strike flowing into the next. He wore simple training clothes, his hair tied back, and there was something mesmerizing about watching a creature that old, that powerful, practice an art he'd probably mastered centuries ago. He stopped mid-swing, lowered the sword. I woke you. I'm sorry. You were thinking too loud, Jeanne said, surprised to find she wasn't angry. I could feel you through the bond. It goes both ways. Your nightmares woke me first. Eldrath set the sword in a rack, turned to face her fully. You were dreaming about the claiming. When you were 8. Jeanne's throat tightened. She'd had that dream every night for 18 years. I don't want to talk about it. Neither do I. He crossed to a bench, grabbed a towel, wiped sweat from his face in a gesture so human it was jarring. But we have one day before the final trial, Jeanne. One day before you demand the freedom of your people, and I have to decide whether to grant it or watch everything collapse. You're afraid I'm asking for too much. I'm afraid you're asking for exactly the right thing at exactly the wrong time. Eldrath sat heavily, and for the first time he looked tired. Not physically. Vampires didn't get tired, but something deeper. Soul tired. Do you know what happens if I dissolve the protection treaties? If I grant your people true sovereignty? They're free. They're vulnerable. There are 6 other vampire kingdoms, Jeanne. Not all of them believe in the Covenant. Not all of them see humans as anything more than food. He looked up at her. The only reason those kingdoms haven't invaded human territories is because my protection makes it an act of war against me. Jeanne felt cold. So the protection is a leash and a shield simultaneously. Yes. She sat down beside him on the bench, keeping a careful foot of distance between them. Then what's the alternative? I surrender completely, let you bind me forever, and my people stay protected but never truly free? That's been the arrangement for 800 years. That doesn't make it right. No, Eldrath agreed quietly. It doesn't. They sat in silence. Through the bond, Jeanne could feel his conflict, the weight of centuries of impossible choices pressing down on him. And beneath it, something she hadn't expected. Respect for her refusal to accept easy answers. What if it wasn't all or nothing? She asked slowly. What if the condition was gradual independence, a timeline for transition, with your kingdom providing military protection while human territories build their own defenses? Eldrath's head turned sharply. A phased withdrawal. It gives you time to negotiate with the other kingdoms, establish new treaties. And it gives my people time to prepare for true sovereignty without being immediately invaded. Jeanne met his eyes. It's not perfect, but it's better than the current system. Through the bond, she felt something shift. His surprise, his consideration. That would take years to implement, he said. So we have years. You're immortal. I'll be bound to you. I'm not going anywhere. You'd accept the binding? Eternity at my side, watching human governments rise and fall, outliving everyone you've ever known? His voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Why? Because the alternative is letting the bridge break and watching your kind become monsters again. Jeanne wrapped her arms around herself. And because I've spent 18 years hating you for claiming me. But these past few days, I've seen you're not what I thought you were. What did you think I was? A monster who saw me as property. She paused. Now I think you're something much more complicated. Someone who's been alone for so long you've forgotten what it means to be anything else. Through the bond, his emotions hit her like a wave. Loneliness so profound it hurt, fear that she was right, and something dangerous that felt like hope. The third trial, Eldrath said roughly, standing abruptly. Do you know what it actually requires? You said surrender. Willing surrender. You have to accept the binding of your own free will, no coercion, no compulsion. He turned to face her, and his eyes were blazing. You have to want it, Jeanne, even knowing what it costs, even understanding you'll outlive your family, your friends, your entire generation. You have to choose me freely. And if I can't? Then the covenant fails. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. And I lose the only thing keeping me human. The weight of it settled over them both. I need time to think, Jeanne said. You have until sunset tomorrow. Eldrath moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth. If you choose to refuse, I won't force the binding. I'll let you go, even if it destroys me. That's not in the Covenant. No, but it's in me. What little humanity I have left. He looked back at her, and his expression was raw. I've had 200 years to become a monster, Jeanne. You've had 4 days to remind me I was human once. Don't let that choice be the reason the world burns. Then he was gone, and Jeanne sat alone in the training room, feeling his absence like a wound, understanding that tomorrow she would have to make an impossible choice. Her freedom, or his soul. Her people's sovereignty, or his kingdom's stability. There had to be a way to have both. She just had to find it in the next 24 hours. The third trial began at midnight. The entire court assembled in the throne room, every vampire in Eldrath's kingdom present to witness the final binding. Jeanne stood at the edge of the crimson carpet in a gown of white silk that felt like a wedding dress and a funeral shroud simultaneously. The pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with her racing heart. Through the bond, she felt Eldrath's presence at the far end of the room, a maelstrom of emotion he was barely containing. Fear, desire, hope, resignation. He thought she was going to refuse him. The room fell silent as she began walking. Every eye tracked her movement. Predators assessing prey, courtiers witnessing history. She passed Morgaine, whose expression was calculating. Past Lady Seraphine, who looked almost sympathetic. Past Cassian, who gave her the smallest nod of encouragement. Eldrath stood before his throne in full ceremonial regalia, midnight robes embroidered with silver roses, the crown of twisted metal and dark gems, every inch the immortal king. But his eyes, those crimson eyes, were entirely focused on her, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. Jeanne stopped at the base of the dais. Jeanne Greene. Eldrath's voice rang through the chamber, formal and ancient. You have passed the Court of Shadows. You have completed the blood oath. Now comes the final trial. The Covenant of Thorns requires your willing surrender, your acceptance of the eternal bond. He descended the steps slowly. But first, as is your right, you may speak your supplication. One demand, one condition, one price for your consent. The room held its breath. Jeanne lifted her chin. I demand a new covenant. Murmurs rippled through the court. Eldrath's expression didn't change, but through the bond, she felt his shock. The old system is broken, Jeanne continued, her voice steady and clear. Human territories under vampire protection, yes, but without agency, without true sovereignty. I demand a 20-year transition to full human independence. Your kingdom will provide military protection and guidance while we build our own defenses, establish our own governance. Treaties will be renegotiated as partnerships between equals, not overlord and subjects. Impossible, someone hissed from the court. She asks for war, another voice called. Eldrath raised one hand and the room fell silent. His eyes never left Jeanne's. And what do I gain from this new covenant? What do you offer in exchange for 2 decades of protection with no tribute, no control? Me. Jeanne's voice didn't waver. I offer myself freely, not as property claimed by ancient debt, but as your willing partner, your consort, your bridge to humanity. She climbed the steps until she stood level with him. I'll stand at your side for as long as this immortal life lasts. I'll help you navigate the new world we're building. I'll be the connection that keeps you human. Through the bond, his emotions crashed into her. Disbelief, hope, something that felt dangerously close to love. But, John continued, I demand to be treated as an equal, a voice in your court, a say in your decisions, a true partnership, not ownership. You're asking me to change everything, Eldrath said quietly. 8 centuries of tradition. I'm asking you to choose progress over tradition, freedom over control. She met his gaze steadily. I'm asking you to prove you're still human enough to believe in something better. The throne room was absolutely silent. Eldrath reached up, removed his crown, set it aside. Then he knelt before her, and the entire court gasped, a vampire king kneeling before a human. I accept your terms, he said, his voice rough with emotion. All of them. A new covenant, a true partnership, 20 years to build a better world. He looked up at her, and his eyes were blazing. And in exchange, I ask for your willing bond. Not as my claimed, but as my chosen. Will you accept me, Jeanne Greene? Not because you must, but because you want to? Jeanne felt tears on her cheeks. Through the bond, she felt everything he was. The loneliness, the hope, the desperate need to be something more than a monster. She took his hands, pulled him to his feet. I accept, she whispered, and kissed him. The bond exploded between them, the pendant flaring white-hot, and Jeanne felt the final binding snap into place. Not chains, but wings. Not ownership, but partnership. The magic of the covenant transforming, rewriting itself around their new terms. When they broke apart, the entire court was kneeling. Rise, Eldrath said, his hand tight around Jeanne's, and witness the new covenant. A bridge between our worlds, built on choice and equality. He turned to Jeanne, and his smile was genuine, real. Welcome home, my queen. And for the first time in 18 years, the weight lifted from Jeanne's chest. She was finally free, and she'd chosen forever, anyway.